This video is going to be on postmodernism, which I cannot define for you because there's just really not a clear consensus on how it ought to be described in succinct terms. I'll give you my opinion on it because it mostly has to do with opinion, and it has been it's a very ideological term, it's a very politicized term. I have a video on modernism that's 60 seconds, and that's not possible when talking about postmodernism. We want to automatically throw in a lot of different thinkers on the left and come up with this concrete distinction from modernism. But really, there's no fundamental difference to the way we live our lives in the postmodern world as opposed to modernism. So just briefly, modernism is a sort of confluence of different technological and cultural shifts in society that happened sort of out of the Enlightenment period, where aristocratic power subsides, monarchies subside, representative democracies in the Western world revive. You have a whole new educated middle class that make their means through industry rather than agriculture, and rather through aristocracy. So that's our little crash course on modernism, and our lives aren't fundamentally different from that. Postmodernism is a more of an attitude of repudiation against not just modernism, but a sense of lineage in Western history. And this is debatable. Camille Paglia has a whole book, her sexual persona, really challenges this notion. So part of our understanding with postmodernism has to do with the technological changes that make different cultures, different value systems accessible to everyone. And this exposure and coexistence makes authority sort of invalid. So it's like if you have all these religions next to each other, the dogma of that religion is sort of exposed. And this carries forward with other sources of authority in society. So postmodernism is really sort of putting all of this under behind a plane of glass, as though you're in a museum. You're sort of separating from Western history. If we just think of urbanism, we can see these cultural shifts more clearly. So for example, a pre-modern city is typically organized with a coherence to convention. Like there's a conventional architectural style, which in Western history has been refined very slowly over thousands of years. You have most architectural structures being more or less uniform, and the major institutions of society highlighted: a church, cathedral, civic centers, whatever. These are the masterpieces of architecture. And this coherence gives us a sense of belonging, a sense of membership in society, that we're all part of the same affair in the sense that we all share the same convention. Now, if you think of Manhattan, you have the exact opposite, right? All of these competing aesthetic values, competing sets of interests are jostled together, and Manhattan looks like a bed of nails. In many cases, it's very ugly. In the sort of the more recent architectural developments of postmodernism, if you think of Brooklyn and the beautiful brownstones, or just any old neighborhood, you usually have these beautiful old buildings, and then you have these shitty, ugly, almost disposable looking new condos that are going up next to them. And if you think, what does that say about a culture that does that? I mean, you're kind of saying we don't give a fuck about the past. And to the extent that these buildings are made with shitty materials, as seems to be the case, you're kind of saying we don't give a fuck about the future either. So that's kind of a manifestation of the postmodern attitude, and it's prevalent all around the world. Everyone has an opinion on architecture, and in many cases, this opinion is responding to the same phenomena where traditions are just completely disregarded and everything follows a sort of cult of utility and practicality and saving costs, whatever. Now, I wouldn't describe Manhattan as being ugly, and there's no way of going back to what a pre-modern city would look like. We're not going to demolish Manhattan, take down the Empire State Building and put the Waldorf Astoria back in its place. There's nothing to reclaim without completely desecrating what we have. And I would not want to endorse that by any means. So, how do we address this issue? And I would say that contemporary artists deal with that problem. It is very difficult to describe how contemporary artists reconfigured this postmodern world where there's no set way of living your life or understanding the world around you. But I think it has to do with allowing us to see past the cult of consumerism, the cult of utility that colors our perception of everything. Because as postmodern people, we have to, by necessity, be able to distinguish what visual content around us is designed to influence our most immediate impulses. I'm kind of thinking about advertisement here. So we have to be trained to see that there are different ideologies operating around us, different interests operating around us. And that is why postmodern criticism is so obsessed with illuminating the capitalist hierarchy in culture. As much as this makes me sick at this point as an artist, it was, at least historically, completely necessary. I'm not a Marxist, I'm not really on the left, but the sort of obsessive criticism was, at least at some point and to some degree, necessary. Okay? And contemporary artists, as they produce work, they're sort of taking from this reservoir that I described earlier, this aggregation of cultural content, all of the advertisements and paintings in the museums and shit you see on your smartphone, memes. This comprises our visual culture in the postmodern world. And when artists make work, they are seeing past the vested interests that are behind so much of what we see, especially as consumers. Our most immediate impulses are constantly being assaulted and attempting to influence us to buy something. And this carries forward through all of mass culture. And there is truth to this. Whether or not you study the Frankfurt School, whether or not you're a Marxist or you're on the left, there is absolute truth to this. And we cannot just throw away so much of Marxist criticism just because it's ultimately has really bad prescriptions for the world. We have to recognize that the descriptive element of postmodern criticism, criticism from the left in general, was and is necessary in a capitalist society. You want to have that antithesis there. So on a purely artistic level, postmodernism as an idea is necessary. We have to acknowledge some sort of distinction that our current paradigm presents to us. So contemporary artists are allowing us to see past this cult of utility, this cult of consumerism, and so we sort of slowly, by cultivating an interest in contemporary art, we develop a sort of accumulated sense of meaning that art can direct our attention to a sort of mutual awareness where, despite the fact that advertisements trying to get you to buy something, despite the fact that everything that you see is trying to influence you, you can still appreciate this content in a disinterested point of view. And by cultivating contemporary art, you condition your perception to inhabit that world. And in that world, you're sort of free in a certain way from all of these different assaults, visual assaults that try to influence you. So this is what it means to really study contemporary art. You develop this repertoire that allows you to see and relate to people in a deeper way